at December 20th, 1944. 5:47 a.m. Manhay, Belgium. The forest is dark, not city dark, forest dark. The kind where you can hold your hand 6 inches from your face and see nothing. Temperature -14 degrees Celsius. The snow is crusted and hard, and every step sounds like a rifle shot. Corporal James Whitaker, 21 years old, from Youngstown, Ohio, cannot feel his fingers. He's crammed into the half-track beside his gunner, Private First Class Delbert Hoss, and both of them are listening, and not for orders, not for the radio. They're listening for the sound that has been chasing them through the Ardennes for 4 days straight, the grinding engine pitch of a German Panzer. The 441st Anti-Aircraft Artillery Automatic Weapons Battalion has been pressed into an emergency perimeter defense. Manhay Crossroads, a road junction so critical that losing it might open the entire northern shoulder of the bulge, is 300 yards behind them. Whitaker knows the math, yet he knows it like a cold stone in his chest. Their M16 half-track carries 4 linked M2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns. Against aircraft, it is a weapon of terrifying authority. Against a Panzer IV or a Tiger, it is almost nothing. But then the radio crackles with something that changes the equation entirely. Infantry, grid reference 441, estimated 300, moving fast. 300 German infantry, no armor, in the dark, in the trees. Whitaker looks at Hoss. Hoss looks at the 4 barrels pointing forward into the black forest. And then, from somewhere ahead, a flare goes up. To understand what was about to happen at Manhay in December 1944, you have to go back to a problem that began killing American soldiers almost the moment they set foot in combat. In the summer of 1942, the United States Army entered the war with a fundamental assumption baked into its doctrine: that Allied air power would rule the skies above any major engagement. Guns might face a sustained ground-level threat. Massed infantry at close range, in the dark, in terrain that armor couldn't follow. That scenario was largely theoretical. Within 18 months, theory met reality in the worst possible way. North Africa, November 1942 through May 1943. American forces, newly arrived and still learning the rules of combined arms warfare, encounter an enemy who has spent 3 years refining the art of using infantry infiltration to destroy crew-served weapons. At Sidi Bou Zid, February 14, 1943, German infantry hit American positions after dark, using terrain and noise discipline to close within 100 meters before firing. In anti-aircraft crews, designed and trained to scan the skies at 10,000 feet, were utterly unprepared for a threat arriving at ground level 20 meters away in the pitch dark. 43 soldiers from a single battery of the 69th AAA Brigade were killed or captured in that one engagement. Most of them never fired their weapons. The same pattern repeated in Sicily in July 1943, then in Italy, then again in southern France. German infantry commanders had identified the vulnerability of American anti-aircraft positions and turned it into a systematic tactic: suppress the crew with a small fire team, close the distance under covering darkness or terrain, destroy the weapon, move to the next one. The existing solution, the M45 Quadmount caliber mount on a trailer, worked well enough in theory. 4 M2 Brownings firing together, producing a combined cyclic rate of approximately 1,800 to 2,000 rounds per minute. And that figure alone sounds decisive. It is decisive if you can bring it to bear. The problem was survivability and mobility. The M55 trailer mount was towed. It required time to unhitch, time to emplace, and time to establish fields of fire. In a fluid defensive engagement, particularly in the bocage country of Normandy after June 6, 1944, time was the one thing nobody had. Its crews that stopped to set up the M55 in the wrong place at the wrong time were overwhelmed before they could depress the guns low enough to engage the immediate threat. By July 1944, after 2 months of Normandy fighting, the after-action reports coming back to U.S. Army Ground Forces Command used a phrase that appeared with alarming regularity. Crew-served weapons destroyed at position. Translation: the men were dead, and the guns with them. In what those reports were actually cataloging was a systemic failure. Not of courage, not of training, but of equipment. The most devastating anti-aircraft weapon in the American inventory was being destroyed on the ground, not in the air, because it couldn't move fast enough and couldn't depress its guns far enough and couldn't rotate fast enough to follow a threat that came from the tree line 40 meters away at 3 in the morning. Ordnance engineers had been wrestling with this since 1942, and the answer they found, and the answer that would eventually terrify Wehrmacht infantry commanders from Normandy to the Rhine, grew out of a partnership between the W.L. Maxson Corporation of New York and the U.S. Army Ordnance Department. It was called the M45 Quadmount, and by December 1944 it was mounted on a vehicle that could take it anywhere. But before we get to what happened in those frozen Belgian forests, and to what the Germans who survived the night called it afterward, there's something I have to ask you to do. If you want to understand exactly how those 4 barrels work together, and why the Germans who interrogated survivors came away shaking their heads, take 2 seconds and hit subscribe. Every video we make goes this deep into the mechanics and the human story. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And now back to Corporal Whitaker, and to the 4 guns that are about to open up. The M45 Quadmount was, in every meaningful technical sense, a completely different weapon system from anything that existed before it. Start with the fundamentals. Each of the 4 M2 HB.50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the M45 configuration had a barrel length of 45 inches, 1,143 millimeters, and weighed 84 pounds unloaded. The M2 HB was already the most proven heavy machine gun in the American arsenal, and it had been in continuous production since 1933. It had an established cyclic rate of between 450 and 600 rounds per minute depending on adjustment, and its 12.7 by 99 millimeter cartridge, the round that would later become NATO standard, punched through 3/4-inch steel plate at 200 yards with a standard ball round. Now multiply that by 4. The M45 mount, the turret structure that held the 4 weapons, weighed 1,860 pounds fully loaded and ready to fire. It was power-operated, driven by a 24-volt electric motor. That motor mattered enormously. Previous quad configurations had required the gunner to traverse the weapon manually, cranking a handwheel against the weight of 4 loaded weapons. Under combat stress against a fast-moving target, a man cranking a handwheel by hand simply could not track fast enough. The electric drive of the M45 could slew the entire 4-gun array through 360 degrees in approximately 3 seconds. The elevation ran from -10 degrees, 10 degrees below the horizontal, to +90 degrees straight overhead. That -10 degrees was the specification that changed the ground war. Before the M45, anti-aircraft weapons were constrained by doctrine and physics alike from engaging ground-level targets effectively. A gun designed to hit aircraft flying at altitude had elevation stops built in for safety, to prevent the crew from inadvertently firing into their own positions while tracking low-flying planes. The -10-degree depression on the M45 was a deliberate engineering choice. This weapon could look down. It could engage targets in a ditch, in a tree line, in a road cut 30 feet below the gun position. The feeding system was the other revolution. The earlier multi-barrel configurations had used separate ammunition cans for each weapon, which created a synchronization problem. When one gun ran dry, the asymmetric fire interrupted the crew's aim. The M45 used a linked belt system with 200 round capacity per gun. 800 rounds total available before reloading, fed through a redesigned receiver that reduced the risk of double feeds under high heat conditions. The four weapons were bore-sighted to converge their fire at 400 yards, in the range at which the system was most likely to engage ground targets in a defensive position. At that 400-yard convergence point, a single 2-second burst from all four guns delivered approximately 30 to 40 rounds on a target the size of a door. At 200 yards, that same burst, against a tighter convergence, turned a 2-meter stretch of ground into something that looked like it had been raked by a steel plow. The M45 was mounted, in its most effective ground combat configuration, is on the M16 multiple-gun motor carriage, a standard M3 half-track chassis modified with a reinforced rear deck to carry the mount's weight. The M16 weighed 20,000 pounds combat loaded. It could travel at 45 miles per hour on a paved road. It carried the gun crew, typically 4 to 5 men, the mount, and 5,000 rounds of linked .50 caliber ammunition stowed in the body. The combination of all of this, the mobility of the half-track, the depression capability of the mount, in the combined fire rate, the electric traverse, the 800-round ready supply, created something that had never existed before. An anti-aircraft weapon that was also in close-terrain night defense, possibly the most devastating anti-infantry weapon system in the American ground inventory. The first crews who fired the M45 in anger in the summer of 1944 described it the same way, across dozens of after-action reports, without coordination between them. They described it as a sound unlike any other weapon. Not a single crack or a burst, a sustained mechanical roar that seemed to press against the eardrums even through protective gear. The muzzle flashes of four weapons firing near simultaneously created a strobe effect that the crews called the lightning. American soldiers, with the instinct for dark humor that combat produces, gave it two nicknames that stuck. The first, the meat chopper. The second, the Krautmauer, and the Germans who encountered it in prepared defensive positions had their own name. It emerged in prisoner of war interrogation reports compiled by the 3rd Army G2 section between August and December 1944. Across multiple separate interrogations of infantrymen from 3 different Wehrmacht divisions, American intelligence officers noted a recurring German description of the weapon: Vier Teufel, the Four Devils. It was not a name given in admiration, and it was given in the specific language that soldiers use for a thing they fear. December 20th, 1944. 5:51 a.m. Manhay, Belgium. The flare was still descending when Corporal James Whitaker made the decision that would define the next 6 minutes. He keyed the interphone to his commander, Lieutenant Carl Behrens, positioned in a half-track 40 yards back. "We've got infantry on the road, sir. We request authority to engage." Behrens' response came back in 2 words: You're clear. Whitaker swung the traverse control. The 4 barrels swept left, smoothly, almost silently, the electric motor barely audible over the wind, until they pointed down the road axis at a heading of roughly 270 degrees directly west. The flare, burning at about 400 feet altitude, illuminated what was coming. They were on the road and in the ditches on both sides of it, and gray figures in snow camouflage moving fast, using the pace of trained infantry who expected to hit the American line before dawn. Whitaker's first estimate, based on the column depth he could see in the flare light, was 200 men. He revised it upward immediately. The column stretched back into the darkness beyond the flare's reach. Range 350 yards. He did not hesitate. The gunner's seat vibrated when all 4 weapons opened simultaneously. The roar was physical. Whitaker felt it in his back teeth, felt it in his sternum, felt the half-track chassis shake against the frozen ground. 4 streams of tracer. He had loaded 1 tracer every 5 rounds, the standard combat mix. Drew 4 parallel orange lines across the darkness from the gun barrels to the German column. At 350 yards, the convergence was slightly wide of the bore sight 0. The 4 streams were still separated by about 3 feet at that range, and they swept across the road surface and the ditches in a walking traverse. Hoss, the gunner, working the electric control with a practiced touch that moved the bursts left to right across the column. The effect was immediate and total. The column stopped. It did not scatter immediately. Trained infantry, even under extreme fire, takes a moment to process what is happening and issue the response. That moment lasted approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, at a cyclic rate of 500 rounds per gun, the 4 Brownings delivered roughly 135 rounds into the lead elements of the column. Then the column broke. Whitaker watched the gray figures go left and right, into the ditches, into the tree line, moving fast and low. He watched Hoss depress the mount, that critical -10 degrees, and walk the fire into the left ditch, where a cluster of men had gone to ground in the drainage channel. And he heard the change in the sound of the rounds as they hit the frozen earth and snow rather than moving bodies. A different percussion, lower and duller, mixed with the cracks of ricochets going skyward. He heard something else faintly beneath the mechanical roar. He had heard the sound before in training, but he had never expected to hear it at this range and this volume coming from grown men. "Keep firing," Whitaker said to nobody in particular. Keep firing." The engagement lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds by Whitaker's watch. In that time, the M16 expended 1,400 rounds, nearly 3 full combat loads, reloaded once under fire by the 2 loaders working in the dark body of the half-track. The German column, estimated by S2 at between 280 and 320 men, disengaged from the axis of advance and pulled back into the Bois de l'Anglier to the west. A patrol sent forward at first light, 7:23 a.m., found the road and the adjacent ground, and the patrol leader, Sergeant Marcus Keel, wrote in his report, "Approximately 60 enemy KIA confirmed on the road and in the left ditch. Significant blood trail evidence extending into the wood line, indicating additional casualties evacuated or self-extracted. Enemy personal equipment, weapons, and 2 light machine guns abandoned at position." Lieutenant Barron submitted the after-action report that afternoon. In the remarks section, he wrote 1 sentence beyond the standard statistical format. "The M16 mount in a prepared position with good sight lines is, in our estimation, the most effective defensive weapon system we have encountered in this theater. The enemy made no further attempt to advance on this axis." Whitaker's M16 had broken a company-plus assault on a critical road junction. It had done it in under 7 minutes. And it had done it with a crew of 4 men, 1 vehicle and 4 weapons that, 12 hours earlier, were pointed at the sky. The action at Manhay was not unique. By December 1944, it was not even remarkable. Not to the officers of the AAA battalions who compiled the reports, and not to the German divisional commanders who read the butcher's bills that came back from engagements where the Vier Teufel had been waiting. And what was remarkable was how quickly the M45 Quadmount had moved from being an air defense novelty to the backbone of American close-terrain defensive capability. The timeline of that transformation is worth understanding in detail. The Maxson Corporation delivered the first production M45 mounts in late 1942. The initial order was for 1,000 units destined for the anti-aircraft artillery battalions forming up at camps across the United States by early 1943, and those mounts were going to North Africa and the Mediterranean theater on M51 trailer configurations. The towed version. The M16 half-track version, integrating the mount with a mobile chassis, began full production in the spring of 1943. By June 6, 1944, D-Day, the U.S. Army had 7,200 M45 Quadmounts in service across all theaters. Of those, approximately 2,800 were in the European Theater of Operations, divided among the anti-aircraft artillery battalions attached to each corps. The M16 variant, the mobile half-track mounted version, accounted for approximately 1,600 of the European total. The Normandy campaign in the brutal hedgerow country of the Bocage forced a rapid doctrinal evolution. Air superiority over the landing beaches was established quickly enough that the anti-aircraft battalions found themselves with a fundamental problem. They had very few enemy aircraft to shoot at. The Luftwaffe, battered by years of attrition and desperately short of fuel, she could not contest the skies over the beachhead in any sustained way. The AAA crews trained to engage aerial targets sat in their positions and watched the skies. Meanwhile, the infantry fighting in the Bocage was hemorrhaging men against entrenched German positions that were nearly impossible to suppress with direct fire from standard rifles and machine guns. The hedgerows, earthen banks 3 to 5 feet tall, topped with dense vegetation, dating in some cases to the Roman occupation of Gaul, were perfect defensive terrain. A squad of German infantry behind a hedgerow could hold a company of American infantry for hours. The solution emerged from the initiative of individual commanders, not from doctrine. A battery commander of the 110th AAA Battalion, Major Edward Greer, positioned 2 M16s to provide direct fire support for an infantry assault on a hedgerow line on July 14, 1944, near St. Lo, and the combined fire of 8 M2 Brownings depressed into the hedgerow at 200 yards range cleared 180 yards of defensive position in approximately 90 seconds. The infantry walked through. Word spread fast in the way that useful tactical information always spreads fast in a combat zone. Through Battalion S3 sections, through informal communication between unit commanders, through the soldiers themselves. By August 1944, as the breakout from Normandy accelerated into the pursuit across France, M16s were being attached in pairs and sections to infantry regiments as a matter of course. The 4th Infantry Division used M16s to suppress German rearguard positions along the Seine River in August. The 30th Infantry Division used them to clear a German infantry strongpoint at Mortagne on August 9th, the same battle where Whitaker's battalion was being repositioned north toward Belgium. By September, The practice was codified in informal corps-level guidance. Anti-aircraft automatic weapons units will provide ground fire support upon request of supported infantry when air defense mission permits. The Germans took notice at the command level. A translated Wehrmacht document captured in November 1944, originating from the 277th Volksgrenadier Division's Operations Section, addressed the M45 directly. The document, referenced in 3rd Army G2 report dated November 28, 1944, instructed German infantry commanders to treat M16 half-track positions with the same threat priority as tank destroyers. It noted that direct assault on an M16 in a prepared position was likely to result in catastrophic casualties, and that such positions should be either bypassed, suppressed with mortar or artillery fire, or attacked at extended range with anti-tank weapons. The practical problem was that the Germans rarely had the artillery available to implement those instructions. The autumn and winter of 1944 were catastrophic for German logistics. Fuel shortages were crippling armored units. Ammunition rationing was in effect across most of the Western Front divisions. The M16, by contrast, had a reliable supply chain behind it. A single half-track could carry 5,000 rounds of linked .50 caliber, enough for multiple sustained engagements, and resupply vehicles could bring forward 10,000 round lots from corps-level ammunition points. By November 1944, the U.S. Army had 11,000 M45 Quadmounts in service globally. European theater strength had risen to approximately 3,900, including new deliveries to replace combat losses. Production at Maxson's New York facility was running at 200 units per month and accelerating. The Battle of the Bulge, beginning December 16, 1944, became the definitive demonstration of what the weapon could do. Along the Elsenborn Ridge, the 3rd Armored Division's attached AAA battalion used M16s in a perimeter defense that held against repeated German infantry assaults over a period of 8 days. The commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division, whose grenadiers made 4 separate attempts to clear those positions, later described the experience in his post-war interrogation. The automatic fire weapons of the Americans in the ridge positions inflicted losses we could not sustain. Our infantry would not remain in open ground against this fire. He called the weapons by a word his interrogators recognized from previous reports: Vier Teufel. Understanding why the M45 was so devastating, and why it produced a fear disproportionate even to its lethality statistics, requires a deeper look at how the weapon actually behaved under sustained combat use. In the 4 M2HB Brownings in the M45 configuration were individually set to slightly different firing rates through adjustment of their buffer mechanisms. This was intentional. If all 4 weapons fired at exactly the same cyclic rate, the sound signature collapsed into a single sustained roar that paradoxically was easier for enemy soldiers to locate and orient to. At slightly offset rates, approximately a 40 to 60 round per minute variance between individual guns, the sound became a stuttering, irregular mechanical thunder that was significantly harder to localize in darkness or terrain. This was not an accident of engineering. It was a documented specification choice. The Maxson test reports from 1942 noted explicitly that the offset rate reduced the ability of enemy observers to determine the exact position of the firing vehicle, and the thermal management of 4 weapons firing near simultaneously was a significant engineering challenge. Individual M2HB barrels were designed to be replaced after approximately 200 rounds of sustained fire. The metal heated to the point where accuracy degraded, and the risk of a cook-off, a round firing from residual heat without a trigger pull, increased significantly. In a quad configuration, that meant managing 4 barrel change cycles, staggered to maintain continuous fire, and in a vehicle with limited crew space and combat conditions. Experienced crews developed a system. The gunner maintained fire on alternating pairs of weapons while the 2 loaders executed barrel changes on the other pair, working from the body of the half-track. The process took approximately 45 seconds per pair of barrels under combat conditions. A well-drilled 4-man crew, gunner, vehicle commander doubling as fire controller, and 2 loaders, could maintain sustained fire indefinitely with this rotation, provided ammunition supply held. The ammunition itself created a logistical signature that headquarters planners had to account for. A single M16 in a 2-hour engagement could consume 8,000 to 10,000 rounds of .50 caliber. At standard combat packing, that was approximately 22 ammunition cans, each weighing 27 pounds loaded. A fully loaded M16 carried enough for 1 sustained engagement. Every additional engagement required resupply from the battalion ammunition point. In the Battle of the Bulge, with roads iced and under constant artillery interdiction, getting ammunition forward to M16 positions was one of the primary logistics challenges facing AAA battalion commanders. Some positions received resupply by hand carry, soldiers walking 200 to 400 meters through snow with 27-pound cans 2 at a time. The records of the 441st and 413th AAA battalions both document this practice in their December 1944 daily logs. The weapon had genuine weaknesses that veteran crews learned to respect. At ranges beyond 800 yards against moving infantry targets, the convergence of the 4 streams made precision engagement difficult. And the rounds were there. The ballistics of the .50 caliber round remained lethal to 2,000 yards. But the pattern spread enough that a dispersed enemy could take cover between the streams. The M45 was most effective against massed targets in open terrain at ranges between 100 and 600 yards. At close range, inside 100 meters, the minimum depression of the mount became a liability, as the weapon could not depress far enough to engage targets in a ditch directly below the vehicle. Against armor, even light armor, the standard M2HB ball round was essentially ineffective. A half-inch of rolled homogeneous steel, the standard protection on German half-tracks and armored cars, stopped the .50 caliber ball round at ranges beyond 50 yards. The M45 was not an anti-armor weapon. It was an anti-personnel and anti-light vehicle weapon, and the crews who forgot that distinction occasionally paid for the mistake. German attempts to counter the M45 evolved over the winter of 1944 to 45, and the most effective German countermeasure was the one identified in the captured Wehrmacht document of November 1944. Mortar fire. An 81mm mortar team at 400 to 800 meters range, with a forward observer who could walk rounds onto the M16's position, was capable of forcing the crew to abandon the vehicle within 2 to 3 fire missions. M16 crews responded by improving their fighting positions, digging hull-down positions for the vehicle where terrain permitted, using pre-positioned smoke to break observation, and developing communication protocols with artillery and infantry units who could suppress German mortar positions. The other German countermeasure, anti-tank fire from Panzerschreck or Panzerfaust, was effective at close range but required closing the distance to within 100 meters of a weapon that was producing approximately 500 rounds per minute per barrel. The casualty rate among German soldiers attempting this approach was, by the captured interrogation records, prohibitive. The weapon was, in the end, nearly as dangerous to approach as to face. The M45 Quadmount did not end with the war. Production of the M16 multiple-gun motor carriage continued through VE Day in May 1945, with Maxson delivering the last units in June 1945. Total production of the M45 mount across all configurations, trailer-mounted M51, half-track M16, and fixed emplacement variants, reached approximately 10,000 units by the end of the war. Total .50 caliber ammunition expended by AAA units in the European theater between D-Day and VE Day exceeded 860 million rounds. The U.S. Army immediately began evaluating the M45 for post-war service. The Korean War, which began June 1950, demonstrated that the system remained devastatingly effective against massed infantry assault, the very threat it had been refined to meet in Belgium 6 years earlier. M16s and M50s saw extensive combat on the Korean peninsula, and the after-action reports from Korea read in places almost identically to those from the Ardennes. Massed Chinese infantry, night attacks, the M45 holding perimeters that would otherwise have been overrun. The M45 remained in U.S. service until the mid-1960s, when it was gradually replaced by the M163 VADS, the Vulcan Air Defense System, a single 20mm rotary cannon with a much higher cyclic rate. The M45 was transferred to Allied nations' inventories. South Korea, Taiwan, Israel, even numerous others continued to operate the system through the 1970s. The engineering principles embedded in the M45, power traverse, multi-barrel convergence, mobile integration, depressed fire against ground targets, became foundational doctrine for every subsequent self-propelled anti-aircraft system the United States designed. The lineage runs clearly from the M45 to the M163, then to the Bradley Linebacker, and to the current suite of mobile close-in air defense systems fielded by the U.S. Army today. The specific term, Vier Teufel, 4 devils, was declassified along with the 3rd Army G2 interrogation records in 1953. Most of the veterans who had operated the M45 in the Ardennes never knew their weapon had a German name. They had their own names for it. They were the ones who had to reload it in the dark. Corporal James Whitaker was discharged from the U.S. Army on September 4th, 1945, at Fort Dix, New Jersey. He was 22 years old. He went back to Youngstown, Ohio. He worked for 31 years at the Republic Steel plant on the south side of the city. He married in 1947, had 3 children, and coached youth baseball for a decade in the 1950s. He never described the engagement at Manhay to his family, not in any detail. His daughter, in an interview she gave to a local historical society in 1992, said she had known her father was in the Battle of the Bulge, because she had found a citation in a shoebox in the basement. But he had never discussed it. She said that the only time he ever referenced his time in Belgium, he had used 2 words: cold and loud. Lieutenant Carl Behrens, the battery commander who gave Whitaker clearance to fire on that December morning, remained in the Army. He retired in 1963 as a lieutenant colonel. In 1978, he contributed to an oral history project at the U.S. Army Military History Institute at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. His interview, which runs to 37 pages of transcript, spends 11 pages on the Manhay engagement and the subsequent defensive operations through January 1945. He is precise about the numbers. He is less precise about some of the other things. At one point in the interview, the historian conducting the session asks him, "What do you think the weapon meant in terms of what happened in the bulge?" Behrens was quiet for several seconds. The transcript notation reads, long pause. Then he said, "I think it saved a lot of my men. I think it saved a lot of the division's men. I think without it on that road on the 20th and the 21st and the 22nd, I don't know that we hold Manhay. And if we don't hold Manhay, I don't know what happens next." He paused again. "I never want to hear that sound again, but I'm glad we had it." Private First Class Delbert Hoss, the gunner who had actually operated the weapon through the Manhay engagement, was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device in March 1945. The citation is specific. "For meritorious service in connection with military operations against an armed enemy near Manhay, Belgium, on December 20th, 1944. The citation notes that Hoss maintained fire through 3 barrel changes and 1 ammunition reload, sustaining the engagement for 6 minutes and 40 seconds under enemy counterfire." Hoss did not receive the citation at an awards ceremony. It was mailed to his home in Dayton, Ohio, 3 months after he was discharged. He was already back at his father's hardware store by then, stocking shelves. He kept the citation in a drawer. He never told anyone what he had seen in the light of the flare. He never described to anyone who knew him after the war. And the sound of 4 Brownings opening up in a Belgian forest at 6 in the morning on the shortest days of the year. He just went home, and he stocked shelves, and some nights, his wife said, he would sit at the kitchen table long after dinner was cleared and just look out the window at the dark yard, not saying anything, watching the shadow line where the light from the kitchen stopped. There were a lot of men like him. Men who held things together in the dark with whatever they had, and then came home and put it in a drawer. The weapon they operated had a German name, 4 Devils. They were just Americans. They were 21 years old. If this story moved you, if you think about those men sitting in a frozen Belgian forest with 4 gun barrels pointed into the dark, holding a crossroads that the outcome of a battle might depend on, then hit like on this video. It's the easiest thing you can do for the men in this story. It costs you nothing, and then it helps more people find their story. Subscribe if you haven't already. Every video we produce goes this deep into the history, the mechanics, the tactics, the human beings behind the equipment. Hit the notification bell so you know when the next one drops. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Did someone in your family serve in World War II or Korea? Did they ever talk about what they saw? Leave it below. We read every comment. These men held the line. The least we can do is remember their names. For Whitaker, for Hoss, for Behrens, for every crew that loaded and fired and reloaded in the dark. This one's for them.